Welcome to the Blackwell archives. The manuscript labeled 17B was discovered inside a sealed wooden drawer beneath the floorboards of an abandoned caretaker's cabin on the eastern edge of Briarholt Wood. The ink had bled in several places, the pages warped by moisture, but the handwriting remained legible enough to reconstruct the narrative. The following is a transcription of its contents, left as intact as possible to preserve its intent, tone, and chronology. The caretaker of Briarholt Wood, whose identity was later assumed to be Edmund Hale, begins with an account of his arrival. He describes the forest as if it were a living, breathing organism, its branches interlocking like ribs above a blackened corridor. The locals insisted he should avoid the deepest areas of the woods, especially after dusk, warning him of old structures that had been built long before the region was mapped. Hale's tone suggests he dismissed these warnings as superstition, but over time the forest began to assert itself into his thoughts. The sounds beneath the soil, the way the fog gathered in places untouched by wind, and the odd feeling that the paths rearranged themselves depending on who walked them. He writes that near the end of his third year, a portion of the forest floor collapsed after heavy rainfall, revealing what appeared to be steps carved directly into the stone. These led downward into a subterranean chamber hidden for what must have been centuries. Hole describes feeling compelled to descend, though he could not articulate why. The air grew colder with every step, not in a natural way, but in a manner that suggested something below was absorbing the warmth rather than the environment simply lacking it. At the base of the stairs lay a narrow passage of smooth walls coated in a soot-like material. The tunnel led to an underground chapel, circular and constructed from stone darker than basalt. Nothing in the architecture resembled the region's historic churches. The ceiling formed a dome, and within its center was a small aperture that allowed a distant shaft of daylight to fall directly onto a raised platform. On the platform rested a stone lectern engraved with patterns. Hale could not identify symbols that felt less carved and more grown, as if the stone itself had learned to shape letters through centuries of silence. Hale's writing becomes shakier as he describes his first moments in this chamber. Though the air was heavy and stagnant, he could hear what he described as breathing, not from lungs but from stone and inhalation drawn through the architecture itself. He felt watched, not by an entity or presence, but by the space. He sensed that the chapel had been waiting a very long time for someone to rediscover it. He writes that the sound grew louder the longer he remained, rising to a low hum that thrummed in his teeth. When he touched the lectern, the stone felt warm in places and icy in others, as though its temperature shifted according to his pulse. Atop the lectern lay a thin sheet of metal resembling a page, engraved with dozens of rows of symbols. Hale assumed it was a type of scripture, though it bore no resemblance to any language he knew. He returned to the surface, shaken but determined to document everything. Over the next several weeks, he descended daily into the chapel, sketching its layout, attempting rubbings of the symbols, and recording changes in the chamber. Each time, something was different. The patterns on the walls shifted slightly. The platform appeared higher or lower, and the ambient hum changed pitch as if responding to him. The daylight shaft also narrowed, as though the aperture above had begun to seal itself. Hale notes that his sleep deteriorated. Dreams of stone corridors and twisting symbols overtook him. He saw the chapel's dome closing around him, shrinking until he could no longer stand upright. He dreamt of lying beneath the lectern, unable to move as the stone slowly pressed its weight into his ribs, carving symbols into his bones. He woke each morning gasping, convinced the pressure remained on his chest. By the third month, Hale began hearing the hum even above ground. It followed him through the woods like a second heartbeat. He describes periods where he lost hours without memory, often finding himself standing near the chapel's entrance, hands stained with soil. His final descent occurred after several consecutive nights of hearing whispers emanating from beneath the forest floor, whispers mimicking his own voice, repeating fragments of his journal entries in a fractured tone. On that final day, Hole writes that he brought a lantern, rope, and his journal. He intended to seal the chamber or destroy what he referred to as the breathing stone, but the moment he reached the platform, the hum rose sharply in frequency, and he dropped to his knees, barely able to keep his balance. The symbols on the metal page glowed faintly, pulsating in rhythm with the hum. Something about the light made him feel as though his memories were being lifted from him, peeled away and catalogued. Hale suddenly understood why the chapel existed. It was a repository, not for human worship but for human recollection. It fed on memory the way a flame feeds on air. The symbols were not written language, but a process, a mechanism for storing what the stone consumed. The hum was the sound of absorption. He attempted to flee, but the passageway seemed to stretch endlessly, elongating with each step. The light behind him dimmed until it vanished entirely. Hale stumbled through darkness, scraping against the walls that felt softer than stone, almost like flesh. His lantern flickered, then extinguished. He writes that he eventually collapsed, unable to breathe under the growing sensation of pressure, as though the chapel's dome had inverted itself and was closing around him. The manuscript ends abruptly with a final paragraph, written in a hand more frantic than the rest. Haley claims he finally reached the staircase, crawled to the surface, and collapsed outside the caretaker's cabin. But he states with certainty that he was not alone when he emerged. Something followed him out, something without shape, defined only by the absence of sound and the presence of that low hum. It lingered in the trees, waiting for him to re-enter the chapel so it could complete the process of taking what he had left. He ends by begging anyone who finds the manuscript to seal the forest entrance permanently, insisting that the chapel below Briarholt Wood does not store memories, it harvests them. He warns that the stone does not forget what it touches, and once it begins to breathe through a person, the process cannot be reversed. No conclusive evidence of Hale's fate exists. The cabin was abandoned. The collapse that revealed the stone steps has since been filled in by weather and earth. The chapel beneath Briarholt Wood has not been rediscovered, at least, not officially.